My very first garden back in 2004 gave me 12 tomatoes off 6 plants. 12. The plants were enormous, waist high, dark green, beautiful, and nearly fruitless. I had done exactly what the fertilizer label told me to do, and that label was written to sell nitrogen, not to grow tomatoes. It took me years and a forgotten depression era method to figure out what went wrong. Last season, same backyard, I pulled 45 pounds off 3 plants using a trick the modern garden centre aisle will never tell you, because there is no product to sell at the end of it. I'm going to show you that trick today. Stay with me, because the last piece, what I do at the very first flower cluster, is the part that changed everything. So let me tell you who buried this, because it matters. The authority here is not some shadowy committee. It is the post-war synthetic nitrogen fertilizer industry and the garden centre labelling that grew up around it. Here is the anchor you can check for yourself. During the Second World War, this country built enormous plants to manufacture ammonium nitrate for munitions. When the war ended, around 1945 to 1947, those same plants converted over to agricultural fertilizer. Almost overnight, nitrogen became astonishingly cheap and astonishingly abundant. And every fertilizer label written after that was written to move that nitrogen. Not to grow tomatoes, to sell nitrogen. I did not know any of that in 2004. I just followed the bag. 6 tomato plants, a big box of high nitrogen lawn-style food, and instructions that told me to feed generously all season long. So I did. And those plants rewarded me with waist-high, dark green, gorgeous foliage and 12 tomatoes. 12. The label did exactly what it was designed to do. It made my plants look like $1 million. It just did not feed my family. Here is the cost, and it is not only my cost. When I started running comparisons in my test bed and reading the extension publications, what I found was that most home gardeners following standard balanced fertilizer advice are leaving somewhere between 40 and 60% of their potential fruit on the table. Not because they are bad gardeners, because the label was written to sell nitrogen, not to grow tomatoes. That same logic is still sitting on the shelf at every garden centre in America right now. But there was a method before all that cheap nitrogen showed up, a method from back when nitrogen was rationed and a home gardener had to use what was in the kitchen and the fireplace. I found it, I tested it, and it is the reason I now pull 45 pounds off 3 plants. Let me walk you through it. The method itself comes out of a 1943 USDA Victory Garden pamphlet. I came across a reprint of it years ago, and the instructions stopped me cold because they were the exact opposite of what my modern fertilizer bag told me. The pamphlet said to feed your tomatoes nitrogen only at the very beginning while they are young and establishing. Then, once flowering begins, you stop the nitrogen completely. From that point on, you feed phosphorus and potassium, and the sources it named were bone meal for the phosphorus and wood ash for the potassium, things you already had in the house. The reason the pamphlet recommended it was simple wartime economics. Commercial fertilizer was rationed, so they pointed people to the cheap amendments sitting in their own kitchens and fireplaces. Now, I do not take a 1943 pamphlet on faith. So I ran it. I planted the 1943 method on one side of my test bed and modern balanced fertilizer best practice on the other. Same varieties, same soil, same water for 2 full seasons. And the 1943 method out-yielded modern practice both years. Not by a little, by enough that I stopped second-guessing it. That is the kind of thing the garden centre aisle will never put on a display because there is no bag to ring up at the end of it. Here is the science behind why it works. Nitrogen is the growth element. It drives vegetative growth in leaves, stems, all that green. And a tomato plant is a little factory. Every day it makes sugar through its leaves, and then it has to decide where to send that sugar. We call that photosynthetic partitioning. What I mean by that is simply where the plant puts the energy it makes. When you keep dumping nitrogen on the plant, you are standing over that factory shouting, "Build more leaves." So it does. It pours the sugar into foliage, and the fruit gets whatever is left over. That was my 2004 garden in one sentence. When you cut the nitrogen off at flowering, you change the order. The factory stops being told to build leaves, and it starts moving that sugar into flowers and fruit. The phosphorus funds the flowering and the root work. The potassium funds the fruit fill, the size, the firmness, the sugar. And there is one more piece most people miss: calcium. Calcium has to arrive fresh at the exact moment the fruit is setting because of something called calcium mobility. What that means is calcium does not move once the plant places it. Once a leaf has it, it is locked in that leaf forever. The plant cannot pull it back out and hand it to a new tomato. So the fruit has to get fresh calcium right at fruit set, or the bottom of that tomato goes black with blossom end rot. That is why the standard advice to just dump more calcium in the soil misses. It is an uptake timing problem, not a soil quantity problem. And it is exactly the kind of detail the label has no reason to teach you. So here is what I actually do now. The 3-phase version I run every season. For the first 3 to 4 weeks after transplant, I feed nitrogen forward. The young plant genuinely needs it to build its frame. Then, the moment I see that first flowering start, I switch. I cut the nitrogen and move to a low nitrogen, high phosphorus, high potassium feed. Think a 5, 10, 15 ratio, low first number, higher second and third. And I make sure calcium is available right at fruit set. That is the whole switch. Nitrogen early, then choke it off and feed the fruit, not the foliage. The results are not subtle. Last season, same backyard where I once got 12 tomatoes, I pulled 45 pounds off 3 plants, 3 heirlooms, a Brandywine, a Cherokee Purple, and a Black Crim. Same dirt that gave me a failing grade in 2004. The only thing that changed was when I fed nitrogen and when I stopped. And I did not just weigh them. I put my Brix refractometer on them. That is a little tool that reads sugar content, and higher Brix means the plant actually moved enough energy into the fruit. The numbers were up across the board compared to my old balanced fertilizer plants. More fruit and sweeter fruit because the sugar went where I wanted it to go. And before you tell yourself this only works in my particular mountain clay, let me give you the case that convinced me it generalizes. Back around 2008, my neighbour Carol had the same problem I did. Tall, leafy, beautiful tomato plants barely setting fruit. She was running a 20-20-20, a balanced feed straight through the season. I talked her into switching to a 5-10-15 once her plants started flowering. That same season, her plants loaded up. Different yard, different soil, same result. The plant does not lie. It is not the soil, and it is not the seed. It is when the nitrogen stops, and there is no product on the shelf that makes money telling you to stop buying it. Now, before we keep going, I want to share something with you. If what I'm walking you through here is making sense, if you're starting to see how much of yield is a feeding schedule problem rather than a luck problem, then I want to point you to where I lay the whole thing out. I wrote a book called Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. Chapter 5 is the full 3-phase feeding calendar: establishment, flowering and fruiting, with the specific amendments and application rates for each phase, including a diagram of the whole timeline so you know exactly what to feed and exactly when to switch. It is the same record-keeping approach I've used for 22 years in my own beds. It is $17 at stevesgardenbooks.com. If you're watching this on your television right now, grab your phone and point the camera at the QR code on the screen. Take your time finding it. I will be right here. If you're on a phone or a laptop, the link is right down in the description. All right, let us keep going. So why did this disappear? The answer is economics, and it is not complicated. After the Second World War ended, the country was left with enormous capacity to make ammonium nitrate. Those were munitions plants. When the bombs stopped being needed, those plants converted to fertilizer production. That happened right around 1945 to 1947, and suddenly nitrogen was cheaper than it had ever been in history. An entire retail fertilizer category grew up around selling that surplus. That is the world we still garden in. Now think about what the 1943 method actually asks for. Wood ash from your own fireplace, bone meal, which back then came out of the kitchen, and the single most important step, simply not buying more nitrogen once the plant starts to flower. There is no product at the end of that. You cannot put "stop spending money" on a shelf and ring it up at the register. Here's the part that really drives it. A customer judges a fertilizer by what they see 2 weeks after they use it. They want the plant to look big, dark green, lush. Nitrogen delivers exactly that visible result. fast. So the labels are written to produce the thing that makes you feel you got your money's worth as green growth, not the thing you actually planted the garden for, which is fruit. The label is optimized for the sale. It is not optimized for the harvest. Now, let me be honest with you, because I do not want to overstate this. Nitrogen is not poison. Young plants genuinely need it. A tomato seedling in its first 3 or 4 weeks is building the leaf surface it will use to feed itself all season. And my own regime leans nitrogen forward in exactly that window. The problem is never that the advice says feed nitrogen early. The problem is that the standardized advice never, ever tells you to stop. It runs you straight through flowering on a balance feed, and nobody on that label has any reason to tell you otherwise, and that is the cost to you. Every season you feed a balanced fertilizer straight through bloom, you are paying real money to grow leaves you cannot eat. That was my 2004 garden in one sentence. Now stay with me, because here is the last piece, the one I teased at the start, what I do at the very first flower cluster. On every indeterminate plant, when that first little flower cluster appears down low, I pinch the whole thing off. The entire cluster gone. I know. In a video about forcing fruit, removing the very first fruit sounds backwards. It felt backwards to me the first time I tried it. But here is the science. That earliest cluster shows up before the plant has finished building its roots and its frame. If you let it set, that tiny green fruit starts pulling sugar and energy away from a plant that is not ready to support it. So I deny it. For 2 to 3 weeks, with nowhere else to send that energy, the plant pours everything into roots and structure. Then it comes back, and it comes back setting far more clusters across the whole rest of the season. I tested it the way I test everything. One plant in the row got pinched, the rest did not. Same variety, same bed, same water. By season's end, the pinched plant was well ahead of every other plant in that row. The records do not lie. And of course, no label and no garden centre display will ever tell you to remove a flower, because removing a flower sells absolutely nothing. All right, before I let you go, that pinch at the first cluster and the sucker decisions you make all season long are really one thing. They are about deciding where the plant spends its energy. That is the single highest impact lever you have for moving energy out of leaves and into fruit. And it is the whole subject of Chapter 4 of my book, Steve's 30-Day Maximum Yield Protocol. It is the strategic pruning system, which suckers to remove, which to keep, the 2-liter training method, the energy budget concept laid out with diagrams so you can see exactly where every cut sends the plant. The book runs 115 pages, start to finish. Now you have the method they stopped printing, and the book is where the rest of it lives. If you're on your television, point your phone's camera at the QR code on screen. Go ahead and grab it now. No rush, I will wait. If you're on a phone or laptop, the link is in the description at stevesgardenbooks.com. So that is the trick. Cut the nitrogen when the flowers come, feed phosphorus and potassium from bone meal and wood ash, and pinch that first cluster. And the plant stops building leaves and starts building fruit. The pre-war method is yours now. No product required. At the end of it, your conditions might be different, so do what I always do. Test it on a single plant against the rest of your row this season and let the numbers tell you. And if you want another cheap, forgotten technique, come back for the $2 pantry barrier I use to stop ants from running aphids up my pepper plants. All right, that's what I have for you today. I'll see you in the next one.